Hello, my art history students. I wanted to make a recording today of a combination of what we're talking about this week. Actually, we are on the subject of Romanticism, the art of the picturesque, the sublime, and the beautiful, and also French Romanticism that we're going to be talking about, which is quite different than the romantic art of landscape painting, but they're both important. So we're going to be looking at Géricault, Delacroix, Turner, and I also want to talk a little bit about Goya, which I'll actually start talking about. Last week, we learned about neoclassicism, and specifically, actually the last 2 weeks, neoclassicism. And last week we thought about David, Jacques-Louis David, and this painting, The Oath of the Horatii, and how it is relevant even today. And we had a very interesting discussion, politics, propaganda, and revolution, and the power of visual images, which many of you submitted some really interesting, you all submitted interesting images as they relate to the current political situation. So I wanted to circle back a little bit to some of these questions about visual images, specifically by starting with Goya, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about romantic art, both landscape painting and the French romantic artists that we look at. So not to shock you guys, but just to sort of begin with a very powerful image, and certainly you guys were probably pretty young 20 years ago, if you were born at all, when 9/11 happened. But these images of the Twin Towers burning and people sort of jumping to their death have become a very important part, very powerful part of American culture. And this is, we live in a visual world, so we are used to seeing images like this. And you probably found it pretty easy to find political images for the discussion that I posted. But in the, 17th century, 18th century, political images were not everywhere, and it was really up to the artists to create them. So I want to talk a little bit about Goya, who was born in 1746. And he really started out just working for the royal family. He painted cartoons, he painted drawings, he did some interesting sort of decorative things, and you can see this here, and he did quite a bit of tapestry work, and he was kind of a lighthearted guy. Nothing serious was really going on in his life. He wasn't trying to make any great political statements. But what happened was, in doing this, he became what we call a keen observer of human behavior, right? There's a lot of subtlety going on here in terms of the interaction, the psychological relationship of who's looking which way, and what sort of psychoanalysis we could do of all these different characters. He was also influenced by neoclassicism, which, as you learned, gained favor over the Rococo style, and he becomes a very pivotal figure. He also goes to Rome, and he studies and he learns. And in 1792, everything changes for Goya. He, in fact, has an illness, and it leaves him permanently deaf. And he becomes isolated from others by his deafness, and he's increasingly occupied with these fantasies and inventions of his imagination, and also very critical and satirical observations of mankind. And in 1799, he publishes a book, a series of etchings that are a satire of what he sees as human weakness, human folly. And it is called Los Caprichos. And in a way, it has become this concept of the art of witness. And here's another one from this series of books, Los Caprichos, number 43, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. It's actually an aquatint. And he is really a very outspoken person in the sense that he is criticizing and condemning the civilization, the society in which he lives. And this is his way of showing chaos and terror, and yes, making a political statement about the bad behavior and about the world that he lives in. So, like a photographer, he's looking for a highly charged subject and creating images that were pretty shocking and were a critique, were a criticism of the society in which he lived. And by the way, they were never really supposed to be published during his lifetime. He was doing this sort of as a more private thing. So the idea that these are prints, right, and etching and aquatint had in Goya's mind the idea that it could be mass produced, that there could be this artistic anonymity, and that he could create a sense of reality. And they're very, very dark. Notice this sort of dark cross-hatching that he's using here, you know, likening people to donkeys or asses, as he said, you know, all of these very political and condemnatory kind of images, and you can see them here. So there's this question of, you know, what is reality? What is fantasy? You know, this, you know, it's interesting to read about how he described these things, and this idea that he's making a political statement, that, you know, this social backwardness he sees in his society needs to be broken if humanity is to advance, and his continued political commentary, his revulsion at what he says is intellectual oppression, is extremely modern, and that's really what's important for you guys to understand. One of his most famous paintings is, of course, this painting, and we need to think about it because we're going to see it again when Picasso kind of makes a reference to it. And you can see here some of the details of the painting right here. Is that it was a witness to an event that happened, a real event that happened, which was after the 2nd of May uprising in Madrid. The 3rd of May, 1808, which is what this painting is, the 3rd of May, 1808. Napoleon's soldiers came in and basically executed anyone who had opposed the rebellion. And there's a lot of symbolism in this painting. What happened was Napoleon used the pretext of reinforcing his army to march through Spain and seize the throne in Spain, and puts his brother Joseph on the throne. And the painting is basically Goya's political statement on what happened, right? So what do we see? We see here the Napoleonic army as, we don't see them, right? We don't see their faces. They are cold, they are impersonal, they are anonymous. And we're focused on this single moment, this figure here, who is completely lit up, right? And let me go back to this one. He's lit up by this light that's supposed to reference a lantern when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He thrusts his hands up in the air in surrender to this faceless enemy and their bayonets all lined up in a row. And another very modern thing is that the paint is applied in a very brusque manner. And this is something we're going to see a lot with romantic artists that's very, very different from the perfectly smooth, finished surfaces of neoclassical painting. So it's interesting to compare David's painting to Goya's here, right? They're both paintings that are speaking about heroism and human ideals, but the way it's painted, right? The elements of art, the physical way that the paint is put on the canvas is extremely different. So brushy strokes, rough paint. This is sort of like a before, everybody all the way from town is lined up, during, and then of course after. And there is a very powerful reference here to Christ, right, to the figure, the pose that he's standing in with his hands up. And you can even see right up here on his hand, he actually has a gouge in his hand, some sort of a stigmata that is supposed to be a reference, definitely a reference to Christ. So there's this very powerful emotion highlighted by the colors, highlighted by the tones, the chiaroscuro, which means light and dark, that eliminates all these pitiful victims, and a very, reflecting the harshness and inhumanity of people to each other, which is in fact the subject matter. So it's a very interesting sort of first look at romantic art, because it's not only the power of the expression, but it is very much the way it's painted. And if you think about just one thing, one difference between neoclassical art and romantic art is that the way the artist put the paint on the canvas, the quickness of the brush stroke, the looseness of it, this kind of unfinished quality, which is going to become really a highlight when we look at Impressionist paint, that is very much, in fact, what these artists are changing and breaking away from. Goya continues to make a series of works of art called The Disasters of War, these starkly realistic etchings on the atrocities of war, and these are in fact not published until after his death. And you can see here very, very gruesome images of, what people can do to each other, murder, execution, etc. So Goya was a powerful guy, right? And I just wanted you guys to see these. Very tough to look at. This figure hanging from a tree, this figure who has had his arm cut off. Yeah, political statements, right? Quite, just the black and white images are so powerful of what people can do to each other. So Goya was inspired by David. He definitely was. He took on this idea of the moral revolution that both David and Goya understood, this way to inspire people to make change, and that we need sort of a new way, a new visual revolution to inspire people to make change in their society. And so I want you guys to, remember that there is a huge legacy. And I just wanted to show you again, this is the Goya painting, and that we're going to see the legacy that he creates later on when we look at this painting by Manet, right? Over 100 years later, of the execution of Maximilian of Mexico. And you can see this very similar idea where we don't see the faces of the executioners. And also, we're going to look at a painting later on in the course by Picasso, where he's making a painting referencing a massacre that took place in 1951, not that long ago in Korea. And look at how he is representing the army on the right and all the bayonets. So it's a very clear comparison between these two paintings. And Picasso was famous for an expression where he said, good artists don't copy, they steal. Picasso was very well known for being inspired and looking at his fellow people. And this was a protest against the United States intervention into Korea, where he quotes directly from the 3rd of May. He also, of course, and we will look at this painting later, makes this very famous painting called Guernica, of the Nazi bombing of the Basque city of Guernica in Spain, where thousands of people die. And I'm not going to get into it now. But I just wanted to talk about, I wanted to show you guys some of these images before we move on to Romanticism, because we did have a discussion about the power of visual images. And here's an artist, Magdalena Epkanowitz, who is very well known for these large, oversized figures that are headless, lined up. And here you can see them in sight. Her art has always addressed issues of courage and dignity and power, resistance. You know, as she grew up in a very highly charged political situation in Poland, and here she is standing among her figures, right? So these are just a few examples. Clearly, the Nazi symbol, images of the Holocaust, other images that we're familiar with, and even a simple image, just something as simple as the ribbon, the red ribbon or the pink ribbon, or any of the ribbons that unfortunately we now wear today. A visual image has a very strong impact. And so I wanted you to see that the legacy of visual images really begins a long time ago in a world where people did not have social media and Facebook and television and even, printed newspapers the way we do now. So it's good to think about it and appreciate it in that way. I wanted to talk a little bit about romantic landscape painting before I turn to the subject of this week, which is really romantic art, not specifically landscape painting, but definitely sort of the art of the political conscience, and specifically we're going to talk about Romanticism in France. Géricault and Delacroix and those artists. But I did want to talk a little bit about landscape painting, which we see here, the picturesque, the beautiful, and the sublime, just for a few minutes to talk to you guys a little bit about these terms and what they mean. And what's important is that when you think about romantic art, it's not the word romantic of, Valentine's Day and hearts and flowers and all that. It is really romanticism that relates to a lot of these kind of novels that we, hopefully you learned about maybe in school, in high school, that is, very, very powerful feelings of the intense state that people can feel, right? Romantic art is very much about these intense states that people feel. And maybe you read Frankenstein or Treasure Island or even Dracula. These are all kind of romantic novels that I want to talk about. And they're really about the themes of the supernatural, death, man's inability to deal with the natural world, sort of the power of the natural world over man, and this idea of time and decay. So it's a really interesting kind of segue into continuing our conversation about politics and art when we just think about sort of nature, right? And how small man can be in terms of nature. And so this word, the sublime, that we start with is really a concept that it creates a sense of astonishment and horror and vastness and power and solitude and awe, that we have this intense emotional spirit that is filled with sensation, right? That the landscape alone can bring out in us. And so I wanted to look at this painting by Caspar David Friedrich. And it's an interesting painting to kind of analyze about how he's trying to make us understand the power, I think, of time. Here's sort of the ruins of a Gothic cathedral. You see the pointed arch, right? And this sort of tombstone, and what are these black things? People have, my students have had different analysis of it. But it's a depiction of the forces that really people cannot control, right? This barren scene, and that in fact God is the divine geometer. God is the person who, or the being who's going to decide our fate, even though we may think that we have, power. And he did several versions of this, Friedrich, the cloister in the snow, and here's another version of it. Henry Fuseli in The Nightmare is a British artist, and this emanates from England. He lives and works in England, and this is called English Romanticism. And he creates a series of works that have to do with stories of demons and fairies and, women drinking some sort of a potion that makes them have these crazy dreams, and demons that come along and carry them off in their sleep or attack them, etc. And so this is sort of another example of a romantic painting and romantic themes that are being addressed. And we are going to get to Turner to talk about that as well. Certainly, what could be more romantic or overwhelming than an iceberg? And if you look at this painting really carefully, you're going to see, where is man here? What happens to man? Here he is, right? He's destroyed and crushed and overwhelmed by the power of nature. And that's what, in fact, happens to man compared to what nature can be. This is another really beautiful painting that I love called Monk by the Sea by Friedrich. And, you see this, again, if you divide the composition up here, you see this little human figure right down, taking up a fraction of the composition. And he is looking off into the distance. He's, just being a monk alone, that the title of the painting teaches us, that this is someone who has chosen a lifestyle of solitude. And interestingly, if you read the book Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, the end of the book, he ends up pursuing his creature that he's created across a polar ice cap, where you see masts of a ship sticking up through the ice. So it's a very reminiscent, actually, to what we see here, right? Again, here's the power of nature, and here's man, right? Just this little, 5% of this whole composition has to do with humanity, and the rest is the power of nature. So Friedrich is an artist who thinks a lot about these things, right? And he does this. And he also is pretty well known for this painting, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. If you look at this painting and you think to yourself, oh, gee, there's something really familiar about this painting, it is, in fact, that a lot of filmmakers and people have used it to kind of make, what is he on the top of a mountain? Are these clouds? Is he overlooking the sea? It really doesn't matter. In fact, he is simply, taking in this whole power of nature compared to man, compared to what he is able to control. Lastly, I want to just talk a little bit about Turner, JMW Turner, who is an artist that we will be talking in terms of romantic and romantic landscape painting. And he has painted the kind of, here's the buildings, the Parliament buildings in England, and they catch fire. And he makes this painting that is extremely modern in the way it's painted, right? And yet it is a very powerful image of nature destroying, what man has created. And in a way, he is an artist who always said that God has delivered his judgment. He uses this incredible atmospheric effects in his paintings, glazes of oil, and he's trying to make paintings that will really change the way people view the world. And one of his most famous paintings, in fact, is this one called The Slave Ship. And we're very fortunate that we have the slave ship here in Boston. So if you remember the movie Amistad, maybe, it's sort of an attitude about how people saw the world and their own humanity. It's truly an indictment of the slave industry, man's inhumanity against man. Because what happened was, if you were a captain of a ship and you were bringing slaves over, And the slaves died, you couldn't get any insurance. But if they died overboard in some sort of an accident, right, finger quote, accident, you could collect insurance. And so this captain, the story was, is that he threw his slaves overboard, and you can see some hands sticking out and sort of kind of the reaction of nature, right? The sky, the clouds, the sun, whatever it is. And one interpretation of the painting is that God is really angry, right? That there's this glow of light and fire of an angry God who decides to, turn the boat over as a reaction to what is happening, to man's inhumanity against man. So think about this, right? Think about when you see it, what is the first thing you see here? And it's really an abolitionist painting of slaves being thrown overboard, and the political picture, and the very sublime language here of man's inhumanity to man. He also does this beautiful painting called Rain, Steam, and Speed. This is 1844. And he says, once you've seen something, it can't be erased from your mind. And the thing about a train at this time in 1844 is that it is extremely modern, right? To be able to go and speed through the landscape in a very fast way and see the world in a new way was modern. It was new. And so he wants to show that there are positives, right? There are good things that man can do, that people can do, and help each other in the world, but also there's this very dark side. And so it's an interesting comparison here between David, Benjamin West, Turner, and where we're going to speak about Jericho and the raft of the Medusa. So we're going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about French Romanticism and several artists. And we're going to begin with this artist whose name is Jean-Antoine Gros. And he's a transitional figure between neoclassical and romantic. He trained as a neoclassical artist, and yet he broke away from neoclassicism. And his art is definitely this transition where it's much more expressive and brushy and emotional, even though he studied with Jacques-Louis David, sort of the neoclassical icon that we talk about. He learns from David, wants to take kind of the power of the propagandistic, the political motive, the political message that David so beautifully presents, and yet he inspires it with a lot more emotion in it. So here he does a painting of Napoleon, right? And notice kind of the big cummerbund and the romantic pose and the sky and the smoke in the background, and the flag is waving and everything is kind of happening. And it's a painting that is loosely painted. It's hard to see, I know, in your little screens, but trust me, it doesn't have the finish that the neoclassical paintings do. And this is kind of the first one that we notice, right? The first one that we see this difference here. It's always interesting to look at somebody like Gros, who was a student of David, and you say, okay, what is he learning? What is he taking from him? And what are the innovations that he's creating? His best known painting is this one, where General Bonaparte, Napoleon, is visiting the sick and the plague-stricken at Jaffa. And it's a really interesting painting. And I just wanted to, let's see, I believe it is 1799. And I want to put it here so that you can see it really clearly and we can speak about it. We are at this kind of really interesting painting. And one of the things that I like to say to my students or ask them when I first put this image up on the board is, what is it about this painting that makes you understand that this is a faraway place, that it is some sort of an exotic place, that maybe we're not in the Western world anymore, right? So look at some of the details that Gros is putting into the painting. These pointed arches, the architecture that speaks of a non-Western source, right? These stained glass windows, the alternating light and dark colors of the masonry, this crenellated element at the top of this wall, and even this that people would have recognized as a minaret, right? The top of a mosque. So there's an emphasis on this, that this is an exotic, far away place. And it would be part of the Orientalist tradition that we learned about um, last week, as well as part of the Romantic tradition that Gros is a part of, right? With the sort of the bombs going off and you see the smoke and look what's here, the French flag, of course, flying above all of it. So however, this is propaganda. What do I mean? What am I talking about? This never happened. This was supposed to be an example of Napoleon, right, coming and visiting the sick who are infected with the plague. And you can see Napoleon here actually reaching out as if he's touching this person, but I can assure you that this, in fact, never happened. And you can see Napoleon's kind of second in command here covering his face with this cloth to protect himself, kind of like our version of today's face masks, right? It is a metaphor. It is a myth. It's something that never happened. And the way Gros is painting this is linking Napoleon very much to a classical tradition. The same way David linked the picture of the father and the sons and the oath of the Horatii to a classical tradition in terms of literally making it look like it was Rome. Gros is doing it here in a much more subtle way. So the elements of this painting that make it a romantic painting are the expressive way it's painted. It's very brushy, it's very emotional, it's, you know, smoky and cloudy, and there's a lot of action going on in the painting. But, you know, he's adding details for emotional impact. He's kind of showing us that he understands and understands and knows the classical tradition. And notice kind of the way he's framing the archways here is also, I think, a reference back to the David painting. And yet it's very different, right? Because this is something that is completely propaganda. It never happened. And Gros is quite well known for that. So I wanted to show you this, and this is another interesting painting. You know, again, it's a representation, David's representation of Napoleon, and Jericho, the artist who we're now going to be talking about, the sort of the charging light cavalryman, an officer of the Imperial Guard in 1814. And so you can definitely see that in this painting that is considered, you know, much more of a romantic painting versus the neoclassical David, there's a very different angle of vision and perspective. There's this powerful diagonal, right? The horse and the rider is twisting backwards against the diagonal of the picture plane. And there's kind of this smoky atmosphere, which gives us the feeling of battle. Jericho is an interesting artist, and this is his self-portrait, and I just wanted to show this to you now because there is a changing definition of what an artist is, right? And here's kind of a very modern take on the brooding artist sitting in his studio, and you can see he's kind of got his little collection in the background of all things that an artist would use, a skull, maybe different elements of the anatomy, and of course his palette. This stereotype of the artist, the romantic artist who's melancholy, who's separated, who's poor, who's living, you know, up in a garret, in an attic, is something that is his representation of the concept of an artist. And it is really a change in the idea of what an artist is. And this is 1818. Probably his most famous painting, of course, is this one, The Raft of the Medusa. And I want to speak about it
for a little bit. He makes this painting, oh, about when he's 27 years old, 1818, and he does over 200 sketches, which are really interesting to see the sketches that he creates for the painting, and you can see how the painting evolves over time. These are just a few of the sketches that he makes. You can actually find many, many more. But to compare, how he goes from this, for example, to the finished painting, I always love to look at sketches that artists make, because it really shows you the thought process, right? You get into the mind of the artist. And it's a really interesting painting because it was, in fact, a true story. It was a journalistic story that Jericho found out about, and he was so outraged by the story of what happened that he decided to make a painting of it. So it's a painting of a true story, yet a very romantic theme, a sublime theme, and really one of extreme emotion, where there's this kind of horror of the violence of what people can do to each other. A shipwreck where the captain throws, cuts the lifeline between this raft, and these people who end up living out at sea for, I guess there were 147 people who start on the raft and 13 people survive. And it was really due to the incompetence of this particular captain, the Medusa, which was a ship on its en route to Africa, en route to Senegal, and there were not enough lifeboats. And so it's a very, kind of the horror of man against man, and the power of nature. All of these things, all of these subjects are romantic subjects, certainly, and they are themes that draw Jericho to this subject, to wanting to make the painting. And what happened to these poor French citizens who supposedly were going to North Africa to settle it, and were subject to this horrific crime, really, of this captain. So instead of towing them to safety, as I said, they cut the tie between them. Um, and it is, it's really a very powerful political image, political propaganda that, by the way, nobody would have known about if Jericho hadn't created this big painting. Because again, this was a time where there's no social media, right? But look at the composition. Look at the composition of this painting. You can see these two sort of implied triangles, one going this way and certainly one going this way. And by the way, all the way in the distance, you can see this little dot, and that is in fact the ship that will save them and find them. It's what we call a double pyramid composition, a pyramid of emotion that shows kind of everything: despair, pain, grief, dehydration, cannibalism. Look at how he has these figures kind of hanging off. And even this guy, we don't even see his face, right? We don't need that to understand. And apparently Jericho built this whole sort of setup in his studio. He went to the morgue. He studied dead bodies, cadavers, in order to make this as realistic as he could. And this is really what makes him a romantic artist, because it's all about expressing emotion, and not intellectualizing. He wants us to look at this painting and he wants us to feel something. And Jericho read all about this. He interviewed the people who were the survivors, 5 survivors. And he had the actual ship's carpenter build a raft for his studio. So it's a really important painting, and I think it's a really powerful example of romantic painting. The next artist we're going to talk about is Delacroix, Eugene Delacroix. And Jericho was a mentor for him. By the way, Jericho, who we just looked at, died unfortunately when he was extremely young. He fell off a horse and died. And so who knows what else he would have produced. Unfortunately, he had a short-lived life. And he produces some really powerful pieces. This one called The Bark of Dante, um, some other paintings, Hamlet and Horatio in the Graveyard, that he's inspired by. This is a pretty well-known painting, The Death of Sardanapalus. And even this one, The Massacre at Chios, which is a political painting, where the French would have been on the side of the Greeks against the empire of the Turks. And so it's a painting that's showing these dying Greek civilians who are about to be slaughtered by the Turks. And it's one of several paintings he made about this contemporary event. So political paintings that we see, kind of the this unrelenting misery, these poor people who are, about to become slaves or to be murdered. And we see this, the kind of the politics of these artists. But his most famous painting, of course, is this one, Liberty leading the people to the barricades, 1830. And by the way, this was an extremely radical painting at the time, because it's a painting that is very much against the new monarchy. And Delacroix sees this scene happening from outside of his window. So I wanted to show you a couple of images that, gives us the sense that Delacroix himself is a student of history. And you can see this Venus de Milo, the Aphrodite de Melos, 100 BC, that he is probably very much inspired by. You can see the profile here. And even this one, our beautiful Nike of Samothrace, that hopefully you guys are all familiar with, from Hellenistic, sort of Greek classical art. It's in the Louvre in Paris. And of course, this painting inspires stage sets from the Broadway show Les Miserables, right? And you can kind of see here the flag and everybody marching against the monarchy. So it's a very important painting. We see here Lady Liberty. Why her top has to be down, I'm not sure, but it's probably a reference to this. Lady Liberty leading the people, literally. She's in profile. Her arm is forward. She's dressed in contemporary clothing, right? She's not wearing a toga that a goddess would be wearing, but she's dressed in contemporary clothing that people would recognize. And she has kind of human attributes. She has a sense of leadership. She is showing kind of the Roman courage and the noble profile that we come to associate with a goddess of this sort. On the left, you can see this person in the top hat, right? He's a bourgeoisie, or a middle class, supposed to be person, and yet a working class person wearing different kind of clothing and hat. Everybody's working together towards this common theme of overthrowing the new monarchy, which was seen as corrupt. It is sort of a statement of the power of the people. You can see in the distance the two towers of Notre Dame, so we know we're grounded very much right in the heart of the city. And it's just again, a very typical, powerful image of a romantic painting, with it's almost as if there's a sound to it. There's almost an acoustic quality to the painting. And again, the way the bodies are kind of strewn on the ground in different states reminds us of, I think, the way that Géricault does that here in The Raft of the Medusa. And we know that there was an earlier painting that Delacroix did of the death of Sardanapalus, and you can see here again people in various states of life and death. So to summarize our discussion about romanticism and some of the images that we looked at today, I just wanted you to remember that when we say romantic, it's romantic with a capital R, not in the sappy, trite way that we tend to think of something romantic, which might be, weak, but a very, very strong way in the Greek rationalist way, that these romantic artists are saying, no, we don't trust this rationalist and self-control idea. We feel that we need to be much more trusting of emotionalism and the full range of human emotion, of love and joy and sorrow and pity and despair, horror, triumph, rapture, that these are all things that we are interested in painting. And I think that a lot of this is, in fact, inspired by somebody like Michelangelo, who the Romantic artists are reading what he has written and they're taking inspiration from him. And in a way that there's, Michelangelo feels that there are these two sides to his art, right? That there's the worldly attached to the heavens, and yet man also needs to be represented, sort of the both sides of what man can be, the good and the bad. And so that's really what I wanted you to see and learn today about the Romantic movement that is true not only in sort of this political ideas, but also in landscape. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. There's a lot of material. Please feel free to delve further into it, and I look forward to next week's discussion. Thanks.